I recently described the 4 players in this assignment. When the deaf woman I just described, not being fluent in American Sign Language, arrives, she was very tired and ended up falling asleep after being seated. The deaf sign language interpreter, who was called to the assignment to facilitate a gestural communication sign language for the deaf consumer, arrived and was unable to locate the deaf consumer, even after asking the secretary, who was busy on phone calls. The sign language interpreter arrived after missing her train. She was late. She was signing and speaking to a person, hoping that maybe the deaf person would notice them and approach. Instead, the deaf interpreter approached, to her surprise. The deaf interpreter told the sign language interpreter that they would be working as a team, facilitating the best communication possible for the deaf consumer. The deaf consumer happened to awake, see the 2 signing, and approached them. The deaf interpreter explained how he would be working with the sign language interpreter. The sign language interpreter would listen to the social work speak, sign everything to the deaf interpreter, and the deaf interpreter would gesture using a more accessible language for the deaf consumer. Right then, before any more discussion, the social worker grabbed them to enter the room where they would be working. The social worker and the sign language interpreter were speaking on the way down the hall, while the deaf interpreter and the deaf consumer had no access. So the deaf interpreter asked for clarification, to which the hearing interpreter provided none, only excluded them. The deaf interpreter wanted to discuss how they would work before entering the room, but the sign language interpreter was resistant, and it was too late, because by the time they entered the room, the social worker was ready to begin the meeting. The social worker seated themselves across the table from the deaf consumer, and the American Sign Language interpreter sat next to the social worker. The deaf interpreter asked the sign language interpreter if she would be willing to switch places, so the deaf interpreter would be able to make eye contact with the deaf consumer and have a more accessible working environment. She conceded. At that point, the social worker and the American Sign Language interpreter, who could speak to the social worker, learned that they had a Hispanic culture in common, so they had a little conversation about that. The deaf interpreter asked for clarification, and the hearing interpreter only stated that they were talking about Hispanic culture and they were speaking Spanish. The second time the deaf interpreter asked for clarification, the hearing interpreter again excluded them from the conversation, the deaf consumer and the deaf interpreter. The deaf interpreter, for the 3rd time, asked for information, more specifically this time, about what the plan for the meeting was. Well, the sign language interpreter asked the social worker, and the social worker described that the meeting would be about some sort of arrest. And the hearing interpreter explained that she had first-hand experience with 3 arrests and that she would be able to act as a deaf interpreter herself using gestures. But again, the deaf interpreter told her that he was there to do expansions upon sign language so the deaf consumer would have better access to the information. At this point, the deaf interpreter was extremely confused. She noticed that the sign language interpreter and the social worker were having a conversation using several different languages, and she was feeling completely left out. She asked the deaf interpreter for clarification, and the deaf interpreter asked the hearing interpreter what was going on and that he needed an explanation. Rather than responding to the deaf interpreter, the sign language interpreter went ahead and tried to gesture to the deaf person, which was unsuccessful. The deaf person was still not comprehending. There was some effort made by the hearing interpreter to work with the deaf interpreter, but shortly thereafter, the sign language interpreter just ignored the deaf interpreter and tried to do the gesturing herself. This went on for the remainder of the meeting, and upon conclusion, they all shook hands and said their goodbyes. The deaf interpreter asked the American Sign Language interpreter, if they had some time to debrief after the meeting. But the sign language interpreter said that she was very far behind in her schedule and did not have time to stay. The deaf interpreter encouraged her to stay just for a few minutes, even walking her out on the way to her car. But she was very insistent that she had no time and had to leave, and then eventually did. Before the deaf interpreter left, he checked in with the deaf consumer to make sure that there was no other need, and as soon as he knew that there was not, then he left as well.